Now that we have our 3 layers quilted together, it's time to trim the excess batting and backing fabric. Hi, I'm Donna and welcome to part 3 of my series on how to complete your quilt project. In this video, I'll be showing you how to square up your quilt, where we'll cut the quilt edges straight and the corners are at a 90-degree angle. Before we start, you can trim your quilt's excess batting and backing fabric on your own and skip to the next part of the series. I only do the following procedure when I know my project will be hanging on a wall because it helps keep your quilt straight and flat. Otherwise, I personally don't need a perfectly squared up quilt to snuggle under it. For this task, you'll need a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, and a big quilting ruler. The bigger your quilting ruler, the better. I'm working on a mini quilt because I don't have enough space to zoom out of a big project. Now ideally this big ruler would be great, but I'll be using a smaller ruler to mimic how the process would look like for a larger project. First, place your quilt on a large enough surface so that it's resting nice and flat. You can roll up one half of the quilt if it's too big for your surface area, but just be sure this other half that we're gonna trim first is flat. If you're working on a table, you don't want your quilt hanging off the edge because the weight can pull your quilt as you cut, which could affect the outcome. We'll be starting on a corner to create a 90-degree angle, so make sure to place your cutting mat underneath where you'll be trimming. Step 1. Align the corner edges of your ruler to the quilt top. You can use one of the seams from your quilt with one of the lines from your ruler to help with alignment. For me, I'll be using one of the horizontal seams, this one here. If you're working with a quilt with points at the edge, like this project, check your 1/4-inch seam allowance so that when it comes time to cover the raw edges of your quilt, the binding doesn't cover those lovely points. If your ruler isn't long enough, you can line up another ruler to create a visual 1/4-inch line. Okay, looks like I'm good to go. Once you're satisfied with the alignment, trim the batting and backing fabric on both edges as far as your ruler allows to create a 90-degree corner. This side here might be a little cumbersome to trim, but we can make it work. Step 2. Slide your ruler and cutting mat up to the next trimming area. Align the newly trimmed straight edge to the edge of your ruler. I'm also using one of the quilt seams as an extra guide to double check my alignment. Then you'll just trim away. You'll repeat this as needed and stop when you get close to the next corner. Step 3 is pretty much repeating the previous steps, making sure to align the newly trimmed edges to your ruler and using a seam on your quilt to double check alignment. Once again, I'm going to butt up another ruler to double check my 1/4-inch seam allowance for this pointy tip here. Just a heads up that I'm turning my project so you can see everything on the screen upright. Ideally, you will not move your quilt. You will move yourself and your cutting mat around your quilt so that it's always resting nice and flat. Troubleshooting. It's natural for your quilt top to get a little wonky during the quilting process, so you might run into some areas where the quilt top extends past the edge of your ruler. It's okay to trim that away. On the other hand, you might run into another area where your quilt top doesn't reach the edge of your ruler. If the edge of the quilt top is comfortably within the 1/4-inch seam allowance, then you're good to go because the binding will hide that exposed batting when it comes time to finish your quilt. But if the edge of the quilt top is not comfortably within the 1/4-inch seam allowance, you might be able to manipulate it by gently scooching that area a bit until it's comfortably within the seam allowance. If it's still an issue, you might consider retrimming that entire side to accommodate this area. Or maybe adjusting the binding seam allowance to hide that batting or to catch any of the raw edges of the quilt top that are exposed, which is an outcome we want to avoid the most. Alright, now that your quilt top is squared up, it's time to make the binding strips and attach it to the front of your quilt, which you can find in the next part of this series. Thanks for watching!